I'm Jason Renaud. Welcome to the town hall on body-worn cameras. Over the next hour or so, I hope we can have a good conversation, be respectful of each other, stay on topic, and be brief. Our brevity will allow for more comments from the participants, which is really what we're all here and interested in hearing. Please note that the chat function is available for asking questions and making comments. And I'll introduce the panel in a moment, but let me catch you up on how we got here. I facilitate the Mental Health Alliance, which is made up of 4 organizations and associated individuals. And those organizations are Disability Rights Oregon, the Oregon Justice Resource Center, Portland Interfaith Clergy Resistance, and the Mental Health Association of Portland. And in 2018, the Alliance became a friend of the court in a long-running courtroom drama called US DOJ versus City of Portland. That federal civil rights case, which has been planned and operated here in Portland since about 2012, brought forward that the Portland Police Bureau had a pattern and practice of harming people with mental illness, especially with the use of tasers. The investigation done by the DOJ of the harm, and that investigation is called the findings, or the findings letter, went into considerable detail about those harms, the type of persons harmed, the regularity and the indifference of the harm, the institutional acceptance of the harm, and found that there was not just the Portland Police, but there were many other components of that harm. The city, the county, the state, maybe even the federal government created a mental health system, and private agencies also, that just wasn't working. And that the mental health system also had a pattern and practice of dumping people they didn't want to help or were incapable of helping into the laps of the police, courts, jails, and prisons. Now, from the findings statement came a settlement agreement between the city and the Department of Justice, which lists dozens of remedies for a variety of real and perceived harms within the Portland Police Bureau. There are even a handful of settlement items which intended to benefit those who were harmed, people with mental illness, and give them alternatives to jail or physical harm. But with the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and of too many others around the country, that inspired weeks of continuous protests here in Portland. And these protests were met with a heavy response from both the Portland and federal police. Those police caused real harms, both physical and constitutional. And this summer, the US DOJ announced that they plan to expand their interest in the Portland police and have been meeting with the city, with the police, with the other parties of the amici of the case, and with the public to talk about body-worn cameras have emerged in these discussions as one viable remedy for the harm done in 2020. Now, while the DOJ is planning about body-worn cameras, the city has already set aside funds to purchase these cameras without much community discussion at all. And this fiscal year only lasts another 7 months, so you should expect to hear an announcement of a purchase fairly soon. So the clock is ticking. So what do we want these cameras for? Accountability? Well, how is that going to work? To help the prosecutors? Well, what are the limits on that? For training or for supervision of police? Whatever the purpose, these tools need to be guided by policy. And that discussion in public in Portland starts tonight. So I hope that tonight we can hear from some experts and most importantly, hear from the participants, the folks with comments and concerns about body-worn cameras, about this new tool and the implications of its use in the law to civil liberties, on police accountability, and the police credibility, and even the credibility of City Hall. So we're here to frame that conversation, the experts and myself, but to listen to you. So, and your comments, which will be disconnected from your names, may be used and incorporated into our brief, the Mental Health Alliance's brief that we file with the court for our status conference, or excuse me, our fairness hearing, probably in January. So this will be very helpful in educating not only the people in this room right now, but the federal court as it comes to its understanding of body-worn cameras. I'd like to mention the co-promoters of this event, the people who helped publicize this. They're the Council of Islamic Relations, the ACLU-Oregon, Urban League, Disability Rights Oregon, Portland Interfaith Clergy Resistance, and the Oregon Justice Resource Center. This is zero budget production, so all these hands make the work a lot lighter around here. A few people were wanted to make their presentations by video. And so I'd like to play those now, and then I'll introduce the panelists. Let's hear from Tess Risky of Willamette Week about what it's like to cover this story from the perspective of a journalist.
Hi, my name is Tess Risky. I'm a reporter at Willamette Week, where I cover criminal justice topics like police, protests, prisons, the like. Tonight's event organizers have kindly asked me to provide my 2 cents on the topic of body-worn cameras based on my coverage of the topic for the last year or so in Portland. So I'm happy to share some of my thoughts with you. So a little background: for a few years now, the city has tried and failed to implement body-worn cameras, but now, due to a convergence of different factors like mediation with the US Department of Justice, contract negotiations with the Portland Police Association, and increased political will on City Council, body cameras are pretty much inevitable for Portland Police Bureau officers in the near future. So that's more or less the easy part, getting the body cameras. The real tricky stuff comes down to the policy itself, of how the footage will be used, privacy, that sort of thing. So for the sake of time, I just want to focus on the topic that matters most to me in relation to this as a reporter, which is transparency. So my questions are, when will the public be able to view body camera footage? In which circumstances can we see it? And will the city or the police union fight its release? And for that last question, if past is prologue, the answer is probably yes. So it's been difficult to report on the city's process of approving body-worn cameras in the past year, mostly because a lot of those crucial public safety conversations have happened in private, specifically, during mediation with the US DOJ and during contract negotiations with the Portland Police Union and the city, which have happened behind closed doors since the parties entered mediation in June. On a positive note, during a press conference last month, I asked the mayor how he plans to address these transparency concerns, and he pledged, quote, "a public vetting of what happened behind closed doors. I plan to be there, and others from the legal team plan to be there." So that's promising, but it's a difficult balancing act. And on a broader level, to me, the situations where body cameras seem the most crucial are fatal police shootings. One example that comes to mind is the 2017 shooting death of Quantis Hayes by PPB officer Andrew Hurst. A grand jury cleared Hurst of any criminal wrongdoing after the fact, but the crux of that case was whether or not Hayes had reached for his waistband, which Hurst claimed he did. But unfortunately, in that situation, besides Hurst, the only other witnesses were also police officers. So that stands out to me as an important time for body cameras because if cops are the only witnesses to a shooting, for example, it's difficult for the public to trust that what they say happened is in fact what happened, and body camera footage would certainly help to clarify or reinforce that. But again, then I go back to when would we see that footage? So typically the police bureau withholds investigative materials, for any ongoing investigation, but specifically for fatal police shootings until after grand jury proceedings have concluded. And a recent example of this is the fatal police shooting of Robert Delgado. So shortly after that happened, I requested the 911 audio of the call that preceded the fatal shooting. The city denied to release that to me, so then I appealed that denial to District Attorney Mike Schmidt, who in turn upheld that denial of the audio. Now, eventually the city did release the audio to me once grand jury proceedings had concluded, but that was about 7 months after the shooting itself, so definitely not a timely release of critical public records, in my opinion. And I worry that the same would be true for body camera footage. So, with that, to the city, the DOJ, the various stakeholders who might be watching tonight, the public is placing its trust in you to have their best interests in mind as you are working to resolve these really complex policy questions behind closed doors. So thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and now I'll pass it off to the other speakers.
Good. Let's hear from Casey Lewis of Disability Rights Oregon.
My name is Casey Lewis, and I am the managing attorney of the Mental Health Rights Project at Disability Rights Oregon. Across the state and here in Portland, police officers have shot and killed multiple people in mental health crises. The Portland Police Bureau has a well-documented history of singling out people with mental illness for violence and arrest. We must protect the most vulnerable in our community, particularly the houseless communities, which are disproportionately people with mental illness and are disproportionately policed by the Portland Police Bureau. It's crucial that any investment by the city in body-worn cameras be accompanied by clear and enforceable policies designed to prevent further abuse and harm. We urge the city of Portland to adopt body-worn camera policies that ensure the privacy of people contacted by the police by storing the video footage outside of the custody of the Portland Police Bureau, create clear and strict criteria around who can access the footage, when, and for what purpose, prohibit officers from reviewing body camera footage prior to writing their initial incident reports. Body cameras should be a tool to hold officers accountable for their behavior, not a method for officers to get their stories straight after the fact. The people of Portland are making an enormous investment, both of money and of trust, in this policy. The city of Portland cannot make policies in backroom negotiations with the Portland Police Association without any input from the communities actually affected by them. Thank you to the Mental Health Alliance for providing this public forum for community voices to be heard, especially the community of people with disabilities. And we urge the city to do the hard work that it takes to get these policies right.
Thanks, Casey. Now let's listen to Jennifer Parish Taylor from the Urban League.
My name is Jennifer Parish Taylor, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy at the Urban League of Portland. Thank you for having us as part of this important conversation on the use of body cameras by the city's police department. We must first ask the question, why is it that Black Oregonians only make up 2% of Oregon's residents, but constitute close to 10% of the state's total prison jail population? This is symptomatic of a failed system. Fundamentally, we need to reimagine how public safety happens in our communities and statewide so that Black and Brown communities don't continue to be disproportionately over-policed and subject of police use of force. The Urban League of Portland was initially a proponent of having our police force wear body-worn cameras as a means of transparency and accountability. But due to a range of research studies finding no evidence that body cameras reduce police use of force, we now caution Portland against adopting new body camera programs, as we feel it is not the best use of the city's limited resources. If our city is to adopt a body camera program, we must ensure that accountability is enforced. We suggest many of the recommendations outlined by Campaign Zero, such as requiring officers with body cams to record all law enforcement interactions and prevent officers from having discretion to turn the cameras off. Allow civilians to review footage of themselves or their relatives and request this be released to the public and stored for at least 2 years. Include a disciplinary matrix, clearly defining consequences for officers who fail to adhere to the agency's body camera policy. Prevent officers from reviewing footage of an incident before completing initial reports, statements, or interviews about an incident. Update privacy laws to protect civilians from having video or audio recordings released publicly that do not contain potential evidence in a use of force incident, misconduct incident, or a discharge of a weapon or death. Lastly, Continuing to fund the police department at the rate we have historically is a question of our values and what we'd like to invest our city's resources in so that our city is a more just and equitable place for all, where all families can not only survive, but thrive. Thank you again.
Oh, thanks to Tess and to Casey and to Jennifer for those recorded comments. I'd like to introduce our panelists now. We have with us Kelly Simon, who's the legal director of ACLU-Oregon. We have Jared Hager, who is with the United States Department of Justice. Specifically, Jared, your position is has changed just recently, so I'm not going to get this right, but I think you're with the police practice group within the Civil Rights Division. Is that correct? Good.
That's right.
And Juan Chavez is with the Oregon Justice Resource Center, and he also represents the Mental Health Alliance in court whenever we go to meet with Jared. Dan Lawrence is with CNA. He's back east, and he is an expert on police technology and body-worn cameras and has written quite extensively, published quite a bit on that. And then we have Oregon State Senator Chris Gorsuch, who represents the District 25 and Troutdale. Thanks everybody for coming. It's good to start at a high cerebral level. So Kelly, could we start with you and tell us, what kind of jeopardy are we in? What's the ACLU perspective of body-worn cameras?
Thanks, Jason. Again, yes, my name is Kelly Simon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm legal director at the ACLU of Oregon. And, I think the ACLU, like many of the partners that you've heard from already, we have a lot of similar perspectives. So I want to start us off with a question. And I like to start, when I think about policy making and problem solving, I kind of like to see ask myself, what's the end goal? I think for ACLU and for myself, that end goal is justice. Jason, you asked me to get cerebral, so I'm going to do it. And so I want to invite the town hall to think about, what is justice? Is justice capturing the death of Quantas Hayes on camera, or is justice that Quantas Hayes is at this town hall with us tonight? And I think it's the latter. And so I want to give us a little bit of freedom to not feel resigned to a body-worn camera program. Now, I think we're in Portland and the wheels are turning and have been turning, and some things are inevitable for now, but they don't need to be inevitable forever. And so I think one thing that would be really valuable to consider is, how can we build into this program a way of measuring the return on our investment? If what we're going for is justice, how do we measure whether this investment in these tools that law enforcement will wear is providing that to us? And I think, the themes of accountability and transparency, those are things that ACLU deeply values. You've heard about privacy, thinking about records retention. I think that we can get really granular when we think about these policies. Who has access? When are the cameras on? When are they off? I think it may be really easy to think, oh, this would be really great if we have these cameras on all the time. So we're capturing everything the police does and we can hold them accountable. What that means is we may be capturing a lot of behavior that is not criminal. We may be having eyes on the public that's chilling the public's sense of freedom. And in fact, in Oregon, we have laws that prohibit things like live streaming protests, for example. The ACLU recently won a case against the Portland Police Bureau for live streaming protests, including internal live streaming. So these are the types of liberty questions that ACLU is asking. But again, I just want us to remain focused on what is justice here. And is it investing in the police and police accountability for when they mess up, or is it preventing police misconduct in the first place? And I think the research has shown us so far that body-worn cameras don't prevent police misconduct. And so I want us to not forget that and not lose sight of that tonight. And you asked us to keep it brief, so I'm gonna stop there because I'm a lawyer and I can keep going on so many things. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Kelly. That's great. That's really helpful to hear. And that makes me think we should hear from Dan next. And Dan, you've done looked at these programs all over the country, implementation and policy, but you also focused. I've noticed quite a bit of your writings about Milwaukee, and Milwaukee's a comparable city to Portland in a lot of ways.
Yeah, sure.
Tell us what your research has shown.
Sure. So as an introduction, I'm Dr. Dan Lawrence. I'm a research scientist at the CNA Corporation. I've been at prior research organizations, the Urban Institute and RTI International as well. So I primarily conduct evaluations of implementation of different types of policing technology. So body-worn cameras have obviously been a pretty large area of my portfolio. The outcomes associated with body-worn cameras started, there's been a lot of research in this, like a lot. The Department of Justice released in 2015 a $23 million to get body-worn cameras on police officers. Wasn't really backed with research because the cameras weren't widely spread. There weren't widespread evaluations of it. We really didn't know what the outcomes of these were going to be. We could theorize, we could have hypotheses, but we didn't really know where how this type of technology would impact police officers' behaviors and their interactions with community members. Since that time, there has been, like I mentioned, just a lot of research on this topic. So some of my work, and I'll try to keep, I'll be specific to some of my work in Milwaukee. I've also done evaluations in Anaheim, California, but I'll also refer to some of the broader knowledge in the field about this. So first and foremost, I think somebody previously mentioned one of the recorded videos that there hasn't been this, there hasn't been found a impact on officers' levels use of force. So that's right. So generally speaking, the results on use of force are pretty mixed across different sites, how they're implemented. The use of force levels before the implementation of body-worn cameras is important here because use of force is really rare in policing. It's about 2 to 3% of police interactions with community members. But you have to keep in mind, every year there's about 60 million interactions with community members. So that 2 to 3% comes out to, millions. Off the top of my head, that's like 10, 12 million use of force cases. So there's a lot in raw numbers, even though it's a low percent of overall police interactions. So keeping in mind, in agencies that have high use of force levels prior to the implementation of body-worn cameras have been shown to have a reduction in use of force. In agencies where they have reached that, for lack of a better word, the bare minimum of acceptable, justifiable use of force levels, that's where you typically see this null impact on use of force levels. So in Milwaukee, we did not find an impact in use of force. On the other hand, the other large area of research has looked at citizen complaints. So there is a lot of nuance in how community members file citizen complaints. There's a lot of nuance in how cities accept them. They might be accepted through the police department. They might be accepted through an external agency. So there's a lot of nuance there as well. But pretty consistently across the research studies, body-worn cameras have had a general reduction in citizen complaints. So the question is why? And just to give some numbers behind the reduction in citizen complaints as well. So in Milwaukee, we found a reduction of 29% in citizen complaints for officers who had body-worn cameras. New York City just released a study in the past, I think it was in the past week or so. They found it was a 21% reduction in complaints. And this has been observed in many other cities as well. So the question is why? Mike White, a professor out of Arizona State University, theorized that there's this civilizing effect, right? If people know that officers have cameras and they're recording them, and officers know that they have a camera on them and they're recording, there's going to be this civilizing effect where the two individuals or more individuals in the encounter might behave differently because they know that they're being recorded. The reality, though, is that, and I mean, this is not surprising to many people in this meeting, when people see an officer, they're not seeing an individual, they're not seeing all the tools on them, they're seeing the uniform, they're seeing the law, and they're worried about the outcomes associated with that interaction. So they don't, most cases, especially early adopters of body-worn cameras, we found this in Anaheim, community members didn't even know that a body-worn camera was present. So I really appreciate that Portland is trying to implement a notification requirement that the officers notify the community member that there's a there's a body-worn camera present and that it's recording during the interaction. I think that's really critical in trying to get people to understand that there is a recording going on. I'll also just mention some of the other research that I think is important in this area. So in Milwaukee, we looked at officers' self-initiated activities. So these are referred to as proactive activities. And the analysis of many different studies has found that having a body-worn camera doesn't affect the amount of proactive activities that an officer does. So these are activities that are outside of their responses to calls for service, a 911 call. So this is when they have free time and they can do things like business checks, parks and walks. They can do subject stops, they can do traffic stops, things like that. So body-worn cameras don't affect the overall amount of proactive activities, which makes sense because there's only a limited amount of time that officers have to do these types of activities in their day-to-day work. But what we did find is that it actually changes the makeup of those activities. So in Milwaukee, subject stops, which can be, pretty confrontational, they're certainly not, the community members aren't willing to have these types of stops, and they have a high likelihood of ending in a use of force. We found that in Milwaukee, body-worn cameras reduce subject stops by 8%. On the other side of things, they actually increase parks and walks by 23%. So officers getting out of their cars, walking the community, talking to people, much more community-oriented policing aspects behavior. So to me, this is a pretty positive finding of body-worn cameras, is that they're reducing those highly contentious types of events and replacing them with more community-oriented type policing activities. And the final thing I'll say is, so the general policy across the country is that any face-to-face interaction with a community member has to be recorded. So that could be a whole host of different types of things. And the reality is that officers aren't activating their cameras for all interactions, even when their policy is that they're expected to. So in Anaheim, we found for the first 6 months of implementation, and this was a small pilot, this was only with 40 officers, it ranged across officers from 0% on one officer activating their camera to 72% for another officer. So still not even reaching 100% of their interactions with community members. We also found that interaction rates increased over time. So this might be getting at officers getting more comfortable with the cameras, increasing their muscle memory and memory in general, just to turn them on when they need to start an interaction. But most critical, what we found is that officers primarily activate their body-worn cameras in instances where they expect a crime has had occurred or that there's going to be evidence collected. So this is really getting at the fact that officers are using this as a tool for themselves. So they're activating cameras in instances of when they're sent on a call for a violent crime or a property crime. Other aspects of policing, such as proactive activities and responding to traffic accidents, those more neutral types of activities of police community interactions, those are not having as many body-worn camera activation proportionally as those crimes are. And I know I just said this before, but I'll finish here. One thing I do want to stress too is that you'll often have accountability and transparency lumped together in this conversation, and it's really critical to separate them. You can have tons of transparency. You can have, mandatory requirements for the city to release body-worn camera footage after a specific amount of days for high-profile instances. So this is something that Austin, Texas does. They have a 60-day requirement that they have to release the footage. I think 60 days is a bit long, but that's what they have in the policy. But in terms of accountability, that's the critical aspect of body-worn camera footage. It's to identify that officers are behaving improperly and holding them accountable for that behavior, whatever that accountability might be. So critical to this is not just the high-profile cases. Those high-profile cases, as terrible as they are, and as much as we all would prefer and hope that they don't happen, they're extremely rare, extremely rare. I would much rather have sergeants be reviewing body-worn camera footage on a routine basis, analyzing aspects of what's known as procedural justice. So are they being respectful? Are they being fair to the community member? Are they giving them voice in the interaction? Are they treating them, do they have neutral decision-making procedures? So those types of behaviors have really been found to support views of satisfaction, views of legitimacy, which also have a whole host of other positive outcomes for building community support alongside the police department in combating crime and other social issues. So having a sergeant hold officers accountable when they're cursing, when they're yelling, when it's not appropriate to do that, that's more critical to me to benefit policing and body-worn cameras is just there's a lot of information in the footage that we're just really now as researchers diving into and learning from. So there's a lot of potential there. So I'll finish there. I could talk all week about this, but I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions along the way.
Well, I'll start just one quick question, and then we'll get on to our next panelist. But did you find any useful consequences for officers that didn't turn on their cameras?
So you mean in terms of like the department doing something to hold them accountable?
Yeah, some immediately slap on the wrist.
If anything happens, it's just going to be a conversation. It might be a verbal warning at most. So the reality is that there's this footage that is often kept in a separate system. So Axon is the main vendor in this conversation of body-worn cameras. They have evidence.com. They have a management system for their body-worn camera footage. It has a lot of metadata behind it, but it's not analyzable. It's not being routinely reviewed in any way that can really benefit sergeants. So most sergeants, when they might have a requirement to review footage on a systematic basis, the reality is that they're just picking a video at random and putting it on in the background and listening to it, making sure that officers aren't yelling and cursing and things like that. So we're not at this point yet, but we need to get to the point where body-worn cameras are automatically flagged when officers are cursing, yelling, being aggressive, things like that, through audio analytics. And that's possible, and that's the next stage of body-worn cameras, but we're, I don't know, a year, 2 years out from that.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Let's move on and hear from a probably very different point of view from Juan Chavez.
Hi, folks. Juan Chavez, he, him pronouns. I represent MHA, and also I'm a lawyer at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. I'll say that, I don't know if I got this directed from Jason, but I'll just say that I'm speaking for myself, not necessarily the Mental Health Alliance tonight. And Jason asked me to kind of take a look at body cameras from the point of view of a practitioner in either civil rights law or criminal defense. So I largely agree with what Kelly and the speaker from the Urban League said at the beginning. What I want is justice. What I want is Quanice Hayes to still be here. I want Terrell Johnson to still be here. I want folks to not be hurt. And at least from available evidence, it doesn't seem like body cameras prevent those kind of outcomes. And that's really crucial to me. And to speak to what the Urban League speaker said, we have a lot of priorities in this city. We should be addressing many other points perhaps than body-worn cameras, but here we are purchasing them and trying to tailor a policy that suits that. So I've also said before that body-worn cameras don't necessarily help the subject in the moment, It's mostly for lawyers and judges. And to that end, I will say that, I've taken cases where there's body-worn camera available. I've taken cases where there's dash cam available, where there's audio available. And then I've also taken cases in the city of Portland where there's basically citizen cell phone camera footage that's only available. I could say that at least building a body of evidence, it's pretty crucial to have the best evidence available. And I'm not going to say that body-worn cameras are that particularly, but it is something. I think looking to the recent shooting death of Mr. Delgado in our city, I think it's clear from the video footage that I've reviewed that Mr. Delgado did not necessarily pose a threat to the officers or to the surrounding people. However, I think if a juror wanted to find that that wasn't the case, there's not exactly a clear enough video to demonstrate the opposite. I think I saw the same thing in the Terrell Johnson case. There was a passing Max train that caught a part of the incident, and we were reviewing probably a square of 40 pixels or so, trying to determine what happened, and it's not the best circumstance, especially when I believe, based on the facts, that Mr. Johnson was wrongfully killed and should still be here today. And I would have liked to have evidence of that. But fundamentally, when we're talking about on the civil practitioner side, what we need in a body-worn camera policy, I think it really boils down to questions of who owns the stuff, who owns the data, when can it be accessed, how can we audit when they are accessed, when the footage is accessed, what can it be used for, how do we keep accountability measures active during each of those phases of people reviewing the footage and knowing where it's going. Speaking just briefly to the Mental Health Alliance, one of our key concerns, of course, are these cameras being used on people who are experiencing mental health crises, who are in hospitals, who otherwise should have strong privacy interests that shouldn't be invaded, especially by a burly police officer who, in this city, we know have overly harmed people going through a crisis. So those are all important questions that should be answered. And I think the most crucial constitutional question that needs to be chiseled into the stone and not messed with is the issue of pre-review. So what do I mean by that? Under our constitutional standard, when officers are taking any kind of action, they have to have some sort of legal justification for doing so, whether it's reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And I won't parse those would take a lot longer. But suffice it to say that both require the officer to be able to articulate what they saw, not what the camera saw, what they reasonably believed that they were perceiving in that moment. And so what's crucial, I think, is if an officer is going to be reviewing this footage, it cannot be when they are writing their reports. It cannot be when they are being investigated by the Bureau or by the DA. It has to be at a far later date when, and if they can file a supplemental report that says, I don't know, I was wrong, then so be it. I doubt that's going to be the case. I think we've seen enough circumstances where police bureaus are presented video evidence of actions to the contrary, and they still dig their heels in and try to assert that your eyes are lying. And so, I don't mean to necessarily speak entirely conclusively on how body-worn cameras will shape out in this city, and I'm hope springs eternal that we'll have a model policy here. But I think I feel like I have yet to be convinced that this is precisely where we need to put our energies. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Juan. Thank you so much. Senator Gorsuch?
Yes, good evening. I'm Dr. Chris Gorsuch. I am also the senator for East Multnomah County. I've been a longtime instructor of criminal justice at Mount Hood Community College. And back in the, believe it or not, back in the 1980s, I was a Portland police officer, long before we had tools like we're discussing now. The one thing I can tell you is just briefly a little bit about what our current law says in the Oregon Revised Statutes. The video retention schedule is interesting. It's 180 days, but no more than 30 months for a recording that's not related to a court proceeding or an ongoing criminal investigation. And I know that this was brought up by some of the earlier speakers. I think we really do need to look at that and see if that's adequate, number one. Number two, once the officer begins recording, that recording is supposed to continue until the particular crime that they're investigating is completed. And in investigations in general, if you have someone who is filming a crime scene, one of the things that you're always told not to do is to film a little and turn it off, and then film a little and turn it off, because that introduces some, questions for people as to what happened in those interim times. The one that I think is most problematic, aside from how long do you hold on to it, has to do with this whole issue of who retains control. And this came up, I think, with one of the other panelists. Right now, the recordings remain the property of the law enforcement agency that's involved. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I am concerned about that myself. It does prohibit the use of facial recognition, which I think is a good thing. And there are limitations in terms of only being able to use these films for bona fide law enforcement practices. Now, the one thing that I can tell you is that I think we need to look more carefully at, for instance, issues of access. We were talking, the doctor was talking about transparency. I think it's really important that if the police department is going to make these recordings, that we really do need to make sure that those recordings are available, not just to the police, not just to the DA, but to the defense attorney, and also in the case of a fatality, the next of kin of the individual. There's also the issue of, who can opt out of being filmed. Certainly juveniles come into this. I think too, we have to be very concerned if any tampering is ever uncovered in all of this. And the one thing I would argue is that very much like other issues around official misconduct, for instance, if you have somebody who is a mandatory reporter of a particular kind of crime and then they don't do it, they can be found guilty of that crime. We don't have any incarceration levels for that, but we do fine people. And I think that's something that we should at least be considering, both in terms of tampering, but also in terms of officers who fail to follow the policies of their department and actually don't turn the cameras on, as we heard from that one case where the person never did. To my mind, that person should have received discipline. And if it wasn't corrected, that person probably should have lost his or her job. One of the issues too, and I was working on a body cam bill last session, and we didn't move it forward because of a concern over this whole issue of retention. And I am not terribly thrilled with the idea that each individual department controls it and then a vendor controls it. And one of the things that we've been working on, and I hope to bring forward, is to have a statewide system that would probably be operated by the Criminal Justice Commission. If you know about the Criminal Justice Commission, they now do all of the documentation of the stop data around the state, getting at racial profiling. So I'm thinking that the CJC might be a good place to have all of the access go through, and then having a statewide system created by the Department of Administrative Services, where we would store it ourselves on a statewide system, rather than having people using outside vendors. Finally, the other issue is it's not hard, apparently, to get companies to provide body cameras so long as you use their vendor for storage. And so I'm really concerned because I want to see this not just at Portland. I want to see this statewide. I want us to have a full, clear, transparent, accountable system that's statewide and that can accommodate not just big departments like my old department of Portland, but the smaller sheriff's departments in the smaller cities, so that we have a full statewide kind of cohesive look at things, very much like the stop data that we're trying to create with CJC. And the last thing that I'd like to say about this is that it's like several of the folks, including the representative from the Urban League, we should see these as tools. It's absolutely true that this doesn't solve our problem. It's another way to gather data, right? But if an officer is involved in an inappropriate behavior, we're gonna need testimony from the people that were involved. The body cam is great, but we're gonna need all sorts of other evidence, just like we would in any other sort of investigation. And I've been able to successfully get a couple of bills passed related to the recording of juvenile interviews. Prior to the first, really, I chuckled because it was shocking to me that prior to our first bill, which said, if you have a juvenile that is in custody for a crime that would be a felony if they were an adult, we weren't mandating the police to record those interviews. So we got that passed. And then in the next session, we got it passed for misdemeanors. But the point is, those things can work both ways. Then you can see it and you can say, oh, did the officer do something inappropriate? Or did the person who's alleged that they did something wrong, are they incorrect? But the whole point is, that's only part, right, of the whole investigation. And so while I understand, the concerns of some of the panelists, I think that it's a good piece of evidence that we need in working towards better resolutions. One thing is for certain, where my agency used to focus a lot more on community policing, we don't have that at the present time. And I think things like body cameras and making sure that the police reach out more to the community in ways that we used to see in times past. I think that overall, this can help the whole situation. But body cameras at least are a good way to collect data, very much like the stop data. And so that's why I'm supportive of that. And hopefully we'll get a statewide, a better statewide bill than the current ORS that we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, and good luck in the upcoming special session.
Yes, thank you. It's one of many this particular year.
Mr. Hager, how did you get here to the idea that body-worn cameras were the thing?
Well, thanks for having me, Jason, and thanks to you and the Mental Health Alliance for putting this town hall on. You mentioned the settlement agreement between the United States and the city of Portland. That resulted in a settlement agreement, a resolution of our claims that required some very basic reforms in 7 areas, including use of force and accountability, training, community engagement, crisis intervention. In 2020, we found the city's response to the racial justice protests resulted in several breaches of that agreement. And because it's entered as an order of the court, a federal court, we found the city to be in contempt of that court order. We issued a notice of noncompliance in April of this year that outlined that noncompliance. And in relevant respect, one of the basic reforms that we require is when an officer uses force against a civilian, they need to report that force before the end of their shift. Their supervisor needs to review the adequacy and the compliance with policy, that use of force, within 72 hours. And quite frankly, that didn't happen within anywhere close to the time required. We found that uses of force in late May of 2020 and June of 2020 weren't reported or reviewed until later in the year, September, October, November. And we didn't receive that data nearly enough in time. And ultimately, because that failure to report, failure to review contemporaneously, it starved the accountability system of one of the basic requirements for accountability, which is that the Portland Police Bureau, the city of Portland, is required to hold officers accountable for violating policy. And that couldn't happen with respect to use of force, and it didn't happen with respect to reporting and reviewing the use of force. And so fast forward to 2021, as we are litigating presently our notice of noncompliance, seeking remedies for breach, we engaged with negotiations with the city of Portland, the Portland Police Association, the Union for Rank and File Officers, as an intervener in the case as a defendant. We have two amicus groups, including the Mental Health Alliance and the Albina Ministerial Alliance, and we mediated a resolution to our notice of noncompliance that would include a requirement that the Portland Police Bureau adopt body-worn camera program. And that is really to remedy some of those force violations with respect to reporting contemporaneously and reviewing contemporaneously a use of force, but also with respect to holding officers accountable for when their force violates policy. And we believe that tool will help with respect to those breaches, serious breaches, but that they'll also have a beneficial effect in all the other areas of the settlement agreement, including enhancing training, including enhancing community engagement, and being able to review an officer's conduct in any law enforcement encounter, including the serious ones like use of force, the constitutionally significant things like consent searches and searches with respect to a warrant, but also less constitutionally significant encounters, including stops, vehicle stops, stops on the street. Also, I would think just rudeness, other types of policies like performance. So we do see there being a well-rounded purpose to body-worn cameras to enhance constitutional policing, which is really the goal of the settlement agreement and the goal of the Department of Justice with respect to police reform. The issue of policy has come up, and obviously that is a huge issue. And I want to assure everyone on this town hall, including the presenters and the participants in the audience, that the settlement agreement requires in paragraph 166 that the Department of Justice review and approve policies before they can become effective. And so we will exercise that right in this case with respect to body-worn cameras, as we have with respect to all Portland Police Bureau policies. What do we want in terms of a policy? The Department of Justice has issued a letter to the city of Portland at their request, outlining what we think would be an adequate remedy for the non-compliance in terms of policy. Those policy principles are split into 6 categories. There is a letter that Jason has just put into the chat that you can read up on, and I just want to briefly touch on them. The first big issue is who wears them, who's going to have these body-worn cameras, and that should be spelled out for any officer who routinely encounters the public, including officers and sergeants. A second big issue is notice. And as Dr. Lawrence had mentioned, we believe that body-worn cameras shall be conspicuously worn, but also that any member should provide verbal notice at the beginning of their interaction with a member of the public. A third big issue is activation and deactivation. And we believe that, as many cities do across the country, that a body-worn camera should be activated immediately upon dispatch to a call or at the start of a law enforcement encounter. I also think the department has made it clear that we think there should be automatic activation. The technology today allows it for when you pull a gun out of your holster, that your body-worn camera will automatically turn on. So there will be no forgetting in those most serious uses of force. Deactivation is also a big issue, and we believe that there should be buffering with any body-worn camera policy, so that 30 seconds before you activate the camera, it's already been recording. It is constantly recording, and 30 seconds prior at a minimum will be saved, as well as 30 seconds after you deactivate. That became a huge issue in Baltimore with the planting of evidence that was captured when officers were seemingly trying to wait out 30 seconds, and someone had mentioned something like that. You can Google the news story. It's pretty atrocious. The next big category is authorized uses. And there are several authorized uses that we think make body-worn cameras an effective tool to ensure constitutional policing. And that is the ability to use it for auditing, any lawful auditing purpose, any lawful management purpose, including live streaming in certain situations. We believe that an authorized use should be for evidentiary purposes, both for criminal proceedings and for administrative proceedings. And part of that would include the independent police review here in Portland being able to have access to investigate complaints of misconduct. And once IPR ceases to exist, the successor body, which is going to be this community oversight board that was created out of a ballot measure that garnered 82% of the vote, that entity should have access to body-worn camera footage to ensure that their investigations have all of the available evidence. And training is another purpose. Across the country, we see that good progressive body-worn camera policies will allow supervisors and allow training divisions of police departments to use this evidence, this expensive tool, to help train officers. There's nothing like seeing yourself on film. I've tried to give oral arguments and filming them in advance, and it's hard to watch yourself sometimes, but it is an extremely valuable training tool to see yourself on camera and evaluate your actions. A fifth big area is pre-review, and we've heard several folks talk about it. Your city, the city of Portland, authorizes its police force to use force up to and including deadly force to effectuate arrests and to enforce the law. That is an extraordinary power. The Fourth Amendment, as Juan alluded to, requires that that force be reasonable based on a totality of the circumstances without the benefit of hindsight. The Department of Justice does not believe it is unreasonable to have a city require its employees to explain why they used that extraordinary power against a civilian without running to a tape. They should be able to explain in the moment why they did what they did without seeing video after the fact. Indeed, we think it encourages officers to be present in the moment, to be able to articulate all of those reasons why I had to use my taser, my baton, I had to take you down, I had to shoot you in advance of looking at the tape. And so this is not a common practice amongst body-worn camera policies in the country, but it is not an unheard of, and we believe it is a best practice. The city of Atlanta's body-worn camera policy requires officers write that report before they review the footage, and we believe that's an appropriate remedy in this case. Again, body-worn cameras is not just the city negotiating with the union. In this case, it is a remedy for the Department of Justice finding contempt of a federal court order in our settlement agreement, and we are going to insist on that policy. A fifth or a sixth area of principles is control. And we've heard a little bit about that. I know there's issues of state law here. We believe that the body-worn camera recording should be kept in their original form and be maintained in that original form by a third-party vendor. That is something we believe the city is in agreement with. A final issue is about accountability. And we believe that members should be subject to the disciplinary process for violating the approved body-worn camera program. And that is a requirement already within the settlement agreement that officers must be held accountable for violating policy. And we believe that's equally, and if not equally, more so applicable to a body-worn camera program. With that, I believe, I've used more than my share of time. I appreciate the opportunity. One final thing I will say is that all of those principles are important to the Department of Justice, but the fundamental principle that we insist on for a body-worn camera program in the city of Portland is that it be informed by public input. And that's why we really appreciate the Mental Health Alliance holding this forum. As part of our resolution for our motion for contempt, we're going to require the compliance officer to also hold community forums to gather public input. The Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing is going to be holding subcommittee meetings to gather public input. We want to hear what the public wants out of this expensive tool, and we will take those wants and we will hear the rationale and we will adopt those into the policy that we approve pursuant to the settlement agreement. Thanks very much, Jason.
Thank you, Jared. Thanks to all the panelists. We do have some questions in the Q&A and in the chat for panelists. You may be able to go in there and answer folks directly. But I want to open up the door and let all the participants in now so we can all see each other. I think you'll all have your microphones turned off, but we'll be able to see you. And as we come to you to give you the opportunity to make your comment or ask your question, then we'll open your mic up. So let's ask Emery to make the first comment. Emery had his hand up first.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Mental Health Alliance, for hosting this, and for everyone who's here. My name's Emery. I use he, him pronouns. I have been, as a volunteer, I've attended a lot of different police policy hearings over the past like 5 or 6 years. So first off, I want to say that I'm really glad the DOJ has been involved in Portland these last couple years. I think it's been really important to have these like court hearings and really have PPB and the city not be able to like weasel out of things because of the influence the DOJ has had. At the same time, I've been a little frustrated with this kind of like imposition of like, oh, body-worn cameras, they need to be on the PPB officers, and it's almost felt like, from my perspective, an imposition and a little bit of this idea that this big change is gonna fix the problem. And we see that from other local entities picking up on that and propagandizing using that idea. So I just wanna go back real quick. The city actually was hosting with like paid facilitators. They were hosting big time forums, hearing from people on body cams, like back in like 2017, 2018. And I was there, I attended as a member of the public. They had police there sitting at the table, like intimidating people, manipulating the process. And, I got a sense there of how complex all this policy is. And I've thought about it for a long time. So, it wasn't even in like 2015, the country, like the federal government, was not even tracking how many people were killed by police across the country. And, the Washington Post started tracking it. The Guardian started tracking it. In other words, these uses of force were just not like, the government didn't care about these people. And so there's something about coming in and saying these cameras, like more technology, more filming of the people is what's wrong here, that just as a member of the public really bothers me. What if the DOJ was saying that the city should have 10 times more journalists who cover Department of Corrections and policing impunity and all these things? Or what if we had cameras to film the behind closed door meetings between the PPB and the city attorneys and all these cities where all this corruption is happening, or between the PPA and the city, which we still can't see them negotiating like union contract policy together. So I've just seen like a lot of impunity happening across all these professions. So like the city attorneys, like they come out and hammer the victims, you know, and it's like, from a public perspective, it's like, oh, so we're going to have body cameras and now we have to like fight the PPA for every shred of evidence, or fight the PPB in the city for every shred of evidence, when like the problem is the professionalized impunity, you know? And I think there's a lot of people here, including Senator Gorsuch, you know, saying we want to have the state step in and prosecute rather than the local prosecutors if there's, you know, or investigate, you know, that is important. But like, it almost feels like we're putting we're taking this step for body cams. Like I'm not assured at all that we're going to get this policy right. And there's all these other steps that we could be doing to take on professionalized impunity and corruption and violence and all that kind of stuff. And I know I've spoken for a while, but I didn't want to write my speech out. I kind of wanted to just like say what it feels like as someone who attends all these meetings and tries all these years as a volunteer, along with you know, I work with like the, you know, family members of people who have been killed by police. And it's like very hard work. And it's frustrating to be like, oh, great, we're going to have the same, you know, body camera policy as this other city where people are killed and there's all this terrible violence all the time too. So
Thanks, Emery.
Yeah.
Jake, you're on.
Thank you, Jason, and everybody. It's amazing to see everybody here. Thanks for hosting it. Juan, Kelly, Dan, Senator Gorsuch, I've already emailed you. But thank you so much for hosting it and for sharing all this stuff, and everybody else who's attending and watching. Thanks for showing up. We need more people to be showing up for stuff like this. And I think I left out Jared's name. Sorry, that was not an intentional slight. And I also echo Emery's passion and can vouch that he's shown up and worked really, really hard, as so have like countless others who have like poured sweat and blood and tear equity into this work. And I think the fact that it's possible that the police union will negotiate for them to be able to control the footage and to review the footage before they write their reports and to not make it publicly accessible. Number one is a slap in the face of the public and the thousands who marched in Portland for police accountability and against brutality. And it's, you know, something that we have to stand for. And you know, Mr. Hager, I would hope that the US DOJ would act in a way that would see this as an opportunity to give power to the people and not be a resource for a professional labor union who already has the power. And we know that 82% of Portland police officers do not live in Portland. The police union has moved their headquarters outside of Portland. It is not even in our city. And so the fact that we're like looking to give power and resources to a labor union over the demands of citizens needs to be heard and valued. And then the final question that I have is, we have footage of police brutality, and that footage of police brutality has led to what accountability? The DA dropped charges against, or didn't bring charges against 12 officers who were on camera. PPB has not disciplined multiple of those officers. The COCL reports and your own reports, you know, in the settlement agreement shows like in 6,000 uses of force, over 725% increase in brutality. And what do we have to show for it? All of that's on camera. Their own footage that Kelly and many others from the ACLU fought to say, what the heck is going on with this? They have that footage, no accountability. the community has footage. I've submitted footage to IPR that they've then pushed out and said like, nope, we're not going to review that. And so part of the problem is not that we need footage, but the problem is when we have the footage, what is done with that? That's what we don't trust. That's where we show that when given to the footage, the police don't care. They don't want accountability. And the union is, working to obstruct justice. And that's the call. And I think from the community is like, if we're going to talk about this is in the hands of the people, then I think we can talk about it. But if it's legitimately just a resource for the police to further distance themselves from accountability, which is part of the concern, then I would hope that we would, not move forward with that.
Do any of our panelists want to pick up Jake's question and see if you can answer what, we could have all the recordings in the world, but without a prosecution or someone act on them, what's the good of this?
Jason, can I respond to that?
Please.
The one thing that I would say, and I think, I've been watching the system since I was a teenager. I started out as an explorer scout in the 70s. And I have to tell you that what strikes me after years and years of observation is that we being leadership of the state and leadership of cities and counties, we will go through the motions of what's mandated by law. And this is true also of public meeting laws and a lot of things. But it doesn't mean that, and I'm not saying they all are like this, but it doesn't mean that all of these agencies act in a way that then carries the spirit of the law forward. It's not surprising to see situations where things are documented and then nothing's done. So yeah, the data's great, which I was touting earlier, but the other part of it is we have to put more teeth into these laws so that cities and counties and the state are forced to deal with this and deal with it properly. And the state and cities and counties, they're really good at telling citizens what they have to do. They're not as excited about accepting that sort of treatment themselves. And so it's not going to be easy, but I think, again, it's probably a legislative function in some ways. Although I think, with the police and with politicians, it has to be a cultural change too, so that we just don't pat people on the head, say, hey, thanks for your info, and then nothing's done. And that to me is one of the most frustrating things that we face.
Let's hear from Mr. Hager on this.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of comments. The first being that we don't have video footage of all of the encounters. We do have some, and I do take the point that not all of those have been prosecuted, and many of them have not. And many of them have not resulted in the police holding their officers accountable. Yeah. And that is unfortunate, and that is a breach of the settlement agreement when that force was unconstitutional or in violation of policy. And we believe that having more systemized video evidence will be helpful to holding those officers accountable going forward. Now, our breach that we found for accountability, we have adopted the people's remedy in Portland, and that is the new community oversight mechanism that takes the power of discipline out of the police chief's hands and puts it into a new oversight board that is being developed by a commission of civilians, including Jason and several others who have been involved in this process. And we believe that will help at least with the administrative process of holding officers accountable for doing their job poorly. And that means violating the policies that govern their use of force.
Right. And
Jared,
Jared, I would follow up with that we have to make sure that in this case it's Portland, but these cities are also held accountable. If they're not, then the officers are emboldened to do other things that they should not be doing.
He's doing his best. Elliot.
Yes, hi. It's great to see so many friends on this call. I would just like to remind people, as many of you know, and I'll put it in the chat, that the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, the body I was a member of and no longer am, made a recommendation in 2019 about body cams, saying if they were to be adopted, that we would have certain guidelines we would recommend, which are many of the guidelines people on this call have recommended. I think the question of whether we're going to have body cams or not is kind of moot in a sense, because we are going to have body cams. City Council has voted for it. The DOJ is going to mandate it. So I'm going to move on beyond that, but just to raise the same questions that other people have raised about the sort of assumptions and the theory behind the body cams. And I wish I were as idealistic as my good friend Jared is about this, but as Senator Gorsuch said, we have the traffic stops data. We've had it for years, and what it continues to show is disproportionate arrests of Black Portlanders in Portland. And there's no evidence that that data then translates into changes in the way the police are dealing with traffic stops. We have use of force reports that's mandated by the DOJ. And what we saw in 2020 was unprecedented uses of force that have not been, officers were not held accountable, even when, as the DOJ and COCO noted, there were video evidence of abuses of policy going on. So I guess it seems like everyone on this call who's spoken so far seems to agree in general sense with this. But what I think I would like to push is the question of what is the solution. Body cams are obviously one tool, along with all this data, to try to keep track of police abuses, which we know exist. I think, though, rather than Senator Gorsuch's proposal of more community policing, more interactions with the public, that in fact the opposite needs to happen. We need to have fewer interactions with the public, and we need to reduce the overwhelming interactions with the public that are over low-level offenses, are of interactions with vulnerable populations like the homeless population, people in mental health crisis, and other folks suffering addiction problems. We just need to reduce those interactions, because I really don't believe that any accountability system, even this new board, this has been tried in other cities. This has been tried in LA, where they have an accountability board that's not, tied to the police. In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, they tried all of the reforms that were supposedly the good reforms, and what we ended up with was George Floyd. So let's try to look at the history and understand what has worked and what has not worked. And I think that the evidence that I see is, as good intentioned as all of these reforms and training and accountability have been, they have not really worked to reduce police abuse, police violence. I think what can do that is simply shrinking the footprint of the police, taking them out of interactions where they do harm and don't help, and creating alternatives to the police. And that's what PSEP has proposed. It's what a lot of community organizations have proposed. And I wish that the DOJ could use its stick to propose something like that, in addition to body cams. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Let's move on to Jonathan Brown.
Thanks.
Thanks, Elliot.
I'm absolutely amazed that what I did in my science, I was a scientist in my life, is completely relevant to what you guys are talking about. And I had no idea when I entered this call that it would be. So I'll tell you what, I'll make it brief, but starting maybe 25 years ago, when electronic medical records started to be available in Kaiser Permanente, we started using those data to improve care and to study patterns of disease and what treatments worked and things like that. I won't go into the details, but it's had a tremendous impact. It's had a global impact because we were one of the first people to do it. And I just want to say, I want to kind of add to what Senator Gorsuch said and others, what it would take to make a transparent way of having these data be available, but still protect people's privacy, and still have accountability, and still have transparency. So you can't just put all the data out on the street. That's not going to work. You can't have it all hidden in a police department. That's not going to be acceptable. I think in addition to having some kind of publicly controlled way to store the data, I just have a list of 6 things here. You're going to need some kind of human subjects review committee to make sure that any research that goes on, and I'm thinking of administrative stuff as well as scientific stuff, it protects people. You're going to have a staff of competent data analysts to do the work, and it's going to be a limited resource. So you've got to have some committee or mechanism to decide what those people work on, because there's an unlimited number of requests that will come in. And so that's an issue. Those people are going to have what I would call scientific independence, in the sense that you don't tell them what they're supposed to find. You don't screw with it after they found it. You also need to make sure that they're doing their job properly. The results have to be published in one way or another. It has to be a scientific publication, but and then there should be some way to accept, if people like Dan, who might get some money from someplace to do a study, some way to let that happen too, if there's outside money to come in. But I think this can work. It'll be a little, it'll have to be set up properly, but I'm kind of excited about it. Thanks.
So I'm going to come back to our expert on from DC, Dan Lawrence. What do you think of a state repository? Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think it does. I mean, I think, we talk a lot about transparency, and a lot of police administrative data is in-house. It's often not released. You have these open source efforts that provide some information to the public, raw data sets, things like that. But in terms of footage, that's a challenge. I mean, you often have officers going into people's homes. You have officers looking at medicine bottles. You have victims. You have survivors of sexual assault. There is a lot of concern with just releasing footage, unredacted, unedited. There's a lot of concern there. So that type of repository could be dangerous, in fact. But I mean, you can look at, I think, I believe it was Spokane when they first had their body-worn camera program. They were uploading blurred body-worn camera footage, all of it, onto YouTube channel, everything. Yeah. So there are ways around this. But I think in the effort of transparency and building, views of legitimacy, views of trust, my point of view is that police departments should be, releasing everything as much as they can, with these considerations that I just mentioned, of course.
Well, that's it for our questions and comments from the community. Do we have any closing comments from panelists? Brief. Jared?
Thank you, Jason, and thanks everyone for participating. I wanted to get to Professor Young's point, and great to see you, Professor, about stops and use of force and the disproportionality. We do know that that's happening. That's the what. We know that Black and brown Portlanders are stopped at a higher rate than white Portlanders. We know that they are subject to higher uses of force than white Portlanders. And body cameras aren't a tool to get at what happened. We know what happened. So-and-so got stopped. So-and-so got shot. What we don't have great evidence of right now is why that happened. And body-worn camera give us better data about why it happened. Right now, officer so-and-so is going to say, I stopped this person because of this reason, and that's the evidence we have. And it's the same thing with the use of force. It's the same thing with a rudeness complaint. And so the body-worn cameras really do help us understand why that is happening and lets us assess why the officer what they said against a reality of a video, and that I believe is part of the value here. We are open to more public comment. I appreciate the critical comments, the constructively critical, and everything in between. Thank you so much, Jason, for inviting me to be on the panel, and thank you to the public for participating.
Thanks, Jared. Kelly?
Yeah, thank you everyone who joined us tonight. I just want to remind us that we're talking about human beings and the safety of human beings. We've been talking a lot about cameras and technology, and I think I don't want to lose sight of the humanity. And I also want to point out all of the voices we didn't hear tonight. I saw very few BIPOC people here tonight, and very few women of color here tonight. And I want to know what makes Black women in Portland feel safe. And those are the types of questions that I want us to be asking and answering. And is it body-worn cameras? I'm not sure. So with that, I'll leave you all tonight and say thank you for the game.
Thank you, Kelly. Always erudite and cerebral. Senator Gorsuch?
Thank you, Jason. The reason that I suggested CJC, Criminal Justice Commission, as the repository for a possible statewide system is because it's not linked to the police. There are some people who question having the labs that we have, the forensic labs that we have connected to the OSP for similar reasons, because of the concern that maybe they're not as unbiased as they should be. Now, everything I've seen, I believe that they are, but I can see where in any of these sorts of cases where you're concerned about transparency, you do want a more independent group. I worry about some of the things that were brought up by the professor, just in terms of third-party groups having control, and that's why I'm more in favor of a centralized system. But in the end, it's true. We have to be very careful about the people, the citizens that are being swept up in all of this. And so that's my concern. If we were to do this, we would have to really enhance the Criminal Justice Commission and their research capabilities. They do great stuff, but they only have a small staff.